In the quiet, leafy suburbs of Ashland County, Ohio, where the wooden houses stand in neat rows and the summer gardens are adorned with vibrant blooms, there stood a home that resembled its neighbors only in its outward appearance. To the outside world, Angelina Williams's family was just another household navigating the stresses of modern life. However, behind those firmly bolted doors, a parallel universe was being constructed. A world built out of layers of pain, unbridled fear, and chilling mechanical restraints. This was not a home in the traditional sense. It was a theater of the macabre disguised as a domestic sanctuary. The protagonist of our tragic story is a 6-year-old boy, a child who did not perceive the world through the same lens as most. For him, the world was a chaotic symphony of sensory inputs. Sounds were often louder and more jarring. Lights could be piercingly bright. Even the gentlest touch could sometimes feel like a physical blow. He was diagnosed with autism, a condition that made his communication with the world a difficult journey of attempts and setbacks. He wasn't asking for much, only for a gentle hand that understood his silence and a warm embrace to make him feel safe when the world became too overwhelming. But instead of a sanctuary, he resided in a house where safety had become a rare commodity and mercy was a forgotten memory, buried under the weight of psychological dysfunction.
Angelina, the mother, lived in a constant whirlwind of psychological instability. She claimed to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but rather than seeking a path toward healing or professional help, she channeled her frustrations and perceived failures onto the fragile body of her small son. She viewed his meltdowns, often the natural byproduct of his autism and inability to communicate, not as cries for help, but as acts of rebellion that needed to be crushed. In her twisted logic, his special needs were a burden that she was unwilling to carry with grace. From this toxic mindset, she began to build her own system of discipline. It was a system that did not rely on words, patience, or guidance. Instead, it relied on professional-grade hardware purchased from criminal supply catalogs. In the shadowed corners of that house, there were no building blocks, no colorful storybooks, and no stuffed animals scattered across the floor. Instead, there were cold metallic handcuffs and heavy-duty ropes used to bind small, supple bodies. For the boy and his younger sister, life was a state of permanent, high-alert anticipation. A heavy, suffocating silence dominated the home, broken only by the rhythmic clinking of metal chains as they were locked around the boy's wrists. The act of restraining him was not an isolated incident. It had become a daily ritual. He was handcuffed to chairs, his hands and feet bound together to ensure he remained still, to ensure he didn't bother anyone, and essentially to erase his presence while he was very much alive.
In another corner of this dark scene lived Mason, a pit bull owned by the mother's uncle, Robert Bobby Makovsky Jr. Mason was not merely a family pet. He was a product of an environment charged with tension and unspoken violence. The dog observed the restrained boy, watching his stumbling movements and his utter helplessness. In an environment devoid of love and positive reinforcement, animals often absorb the chaotic energy of their surroundings. Mason was a sponge for the resentment and aggression that permeated the household. Robert and Taylor, the mother's partner, completed the vertices of this cruel triangle. They were not mere bystanders. They were the architects and enablers of this domestic dungeon. They justified the cruelty to one another, claiming these restraints were for the greater good and that the child was impossible to control by any other means. They built a fortress of lies and denial so thick that they eventually believed their own propaganda, that torture was the only viable form of parenting. The boy spent countless hours feeling the bite of cold iron into his delicate skin. He would stare out of the window, watching the neighborhood children run with absolute freedom, while his own small hands remained prisoners of the handcuffs. He would try to cry out, but his voice would vanish into the hollow corridors of the gloomy house. His sister, who fared no better, was sometimes tied with ropes to a chair, forced to witness her brother being treated like a criminal in a cage rather than a child in need of protection. This chapter of their lives was not just simple child abuse. It was a systematic setup for a catastrophe. Every lock that clicked shut, every knot that was tightened in a rope, brought them one step closer to that fateful day in August 2024. The environment was perfectly primed for disaster. A child unable to defend himself due to both his physical restraints and his neurodiversity. A dog raised in an atmosphere of neglect and tension, and adults who had stripped themselves of their humanity until they saw torture as a means of convenience. The days passed with a grueling heaviness, filled with the scent of fear and the sound of muffled breathing. None of the neighbors knew what was happening behind those drawn curtains. They saw Angelina coming and going. They smiled at Robert, never realizing that inside that house, a small child was being robbed of his childhood every single day. He was being prepared for a fate that would soon shake the entire county to its core. The stage for the crime was fully built, and all that remained was the spark that would set everything ablaze. In the twisted mind of Angelina Williams, the handcuffs and ropes were not instruments of torture. They were tools for survival. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the story, how the fundamental goal of parenting shifted from nurturing a child to subjugating him. Angelina was chasing an impossible objective, absolute silence and total dominance over a child whom God had created to be different. To her, the boy's autistic meltdowns, his repetitive movements, and his constant search for sensory stimulation were nothing more than chaos that had to be suppressed at any cost. Her ultimate goal was to transform this vibrant, living being into a motionless statue that caused no disturbance to her own fractured reality. In the depths of her delusional mind, she genuinely believed that restraining her son was the only path toward tranquility. The goal was never to protect the child from himself. It was to protect her personal comfort from his complex needs. This selfish objective allowed her to ignore the primal cries of his nature and replace the language of connection with the language of locks and keys. And in this dark pursuit, she was not alone. Taylor shared this sinister goal. Taylor viewed assisting Angelina in binding the children as a form of support or loyalty, as if preserving this warped adult relationship justified crushing the innocence of two children whose only sin was existing in that house. Meanwhile, Robert, the owner of the dog Mason, had a different but equally cold objective. He sought an environment ruled by the law of force. To him, Mason was not just a dog. He was a tool for intimidation, or perhaps a reflection of his own internal aggression. Robert's goal was to maintain his small kingdom within that house, shielded from the eyes of the law, surrounded by a dog whose danger was known to everyone. He knew Mason was a ticking time bomb, but he chose to leave that bomb in a room filled with restrained children, so long as it served his sense of dominance and his profound indifference toward others. In stark contrast to the adult's dark ambitions, there was the goal of the little boy. He didn't dream of wealth or success. His goal was so simple it breaks the heart. He wanted to touch his mother's face without his hand being pushed away. He wanted to run across the living room without tripping over a rope tied to his ankles. For an autistic child, the outside world was already a terrifying place, and his home was supposed to be the ultimate goal of peace. But in this house, safety had become the enemy, and total surrender was the only way to avoid pain. The child tried, in his own silent way, to communicate, to tell them the handcuffs hurt. But his quiet goals were trampled under the feet of their grand vision of ironclad order. The collective goal of this family had turned into a process of forced normalization. They wanted a perfect child by their cruel standards, a child who didn't scream, didn't move, and asked for nothing. To achieve this goal, they sacrificed everything. They sacrificed mercy, innocence, and ultimately, the child's physical sanctity. Every passing day was a step closer to the abyss, as the use of handcuffs became an indispensable ritual. They began to believe their own lie, that this child was dangerous and had to be restrained, while the true danger lay in their hardened hearts and in the dog that watched silently, waiting for the moment this fake control would collapse into a bloody explosion. On that day in August, these conflicting goals were colliding behind closed doors. The mother wanted quiet. The partner wanted to suppress. The uncle wanted to hide the reality of his dog. In the center of it all, the restrained boy represented the easy target for all this bottled-up violence. They had built a world of illusory control, forgetting that any dominance built on chains can only end in catastrophe. The goal was tranquility, but the result they were crawling toward was the total destruction of everything human. On August 17, 2024, the warm Ohio sun gave no hint that a catastrophe was about to explode. The house in Ashland was simmering with a hidden conflict, a struggle between the instinct of a child who wanted to be free and the cruelty of adults who insisted on shackling him. On that day, the 6-year-old boy was not playing with a ball or running through the hallway. He was in his usual spot, a prisoner of metallic handcuffs that encircled his wrists and ankles. These handcuffs were the silent party in the power struggle within that home, where the mother and her accomplices believed that iron was the only solution to control his world of autism. Suddenly, the silence shattered. Mason, the pit bull who had been saturated with an environment of tension and violence, transformed from a silent observer into a ferocious attacker. Here, the conflict manifested in its ugliest form, a raging beast with total freedom of movement, pitted against a small child robbed of even the ability to raise his hands to protect his face. The attack began with a low growl the boy did not understand, and then, in the blink of an eye, Mason sank his fangs into the child's neck. There was no room to escape. The handcuffs placed for his protection or discipline were the very things that condemned him to remain at the mercy of the fangs. The physical conflict was horrific. The boy instinctively tried to pull back, but the chains yanked him backward, leaving his neck completely exposed to the dog's mauling. The fangs sank into the tender flesh from both sides, coming within millimeters of the jugular vein. In that moment, screaming was not enough. The child's body trembled between the hammer of iron and the anvil of teeth. Instead of rushing to save him as an instinctive motherly act, a different kind of conflict began in the adults' minds, a struggle between saving the child and hiding the crime. When they saw the blood covering the floor, their priority was not truth, but deception. While the boy was bleeding out, the process of scrubbing the crime scene began. The handcuffs were quickly removed, and the ropes restraining his sister were hidden. The boy was rushed to a nearby fire station as a ruse to make the incident look like an accidental attack that occurred in a yard or during innocent play. But the conflict with the truth was stronger than their lies. When the police arrived, the darting eyes and glaring contradictions in the statements of Angelina, Taylor, and Robert screamed the truth they tried to bury. They claimed the dog was a stray, then claimed the attack happened outside, but the bloodstains inside the house told a different story. The legal conflict began to loom the moment investigators saw the circular marks on the boy's wrists, marks not left by a dog's teeth, but by cold iron. Mason the dog had played his part as an instrument of death, but the adults were completing their roles as instruments of misdirection. They tried to hide the dog and tried to convince the little boy, with his limited abilities, to stay silent. But the wounds on his neck were the mute witness that could not be silenced. That day ended with a mangled body and a shattered spirit, marking the beginning of a battle in the interrogation rooms. The little boy lost his struggle for safety that day, not just because the dog was strong, but because the humans who were supposed to be his shield were the ones who built the trap that prevented his survival. The conflict in Ashland was not just a dog attack. It was a clash between animal brutality and human betrayal, a conflict that left scars on the boy's neck that will remain a witness to those minutes when time stood still between Mason's fangs and Angelina's locks. After the dog's barking ceased and the body's bleeding stopped, the truth began to seep through the cracks of the walls they had tried to patch with lies. The result was not merely a medical report describing a laceration on a boy's neck. It was a seismic shift that revealed a quagmire of systemic abuse boiling behind the doors of the Ashland home. The outcome began to take shape when investigators faced a vast chasm between what they witnessed and the stories they were told. The family claimed a sudden attack by a stray dog occurred outside, but the house itself was breathing evidence that refuted every syllable. The first and clearest result were those purple circular marks on the small child's wrists. Those were not fang marks. They were the imprints of cold iron that had shown no mercy to his childhood. When police discovered the hidden handcuffs and the ropes tucked away behind furniture, the fragile narrative woven by Angelina and Taylor shattered. The conflict was no longer about a dog biting a child. It had evolved into a case of systematic torture under the guise of discipline. The outcome was a shock to the community. While the boy fought for his life in the operating room, investigators were emerging from his home with bags of evidence that told the story of years of restraint and isolation.
In the hallways of the courthouse, the result was embodied in the faces of the defendants, stripped of their victim masks. Angelina Williams stood to face the reality of her actions. She was no longer the mother suffering from PTSD, as she had claimed to justify her cruelty. In the eyes of the law, she became the primary perpetrator who had replaced her embrace with shackles. On June 30, 2025, the sentence that rocked her world was handed down, 19 to 23.5 years in prison. This result was the final answer to every hour her child spent trembling in his restraints. The bars she would now live behind were nothing more than a reflection of the handcuffs she had placed on her son's hands. As for Taylor Marvin Brown, the partner who chose silence and complicity, her result was a sentence of 10 to 15 years in prison. She learned in the courtroom that loyalty in crime is nothing but a shared path toward the abyss. Robert Makovsky Jr., the owner of the dog, did not escape either, receiving a 9-year prison sentence. The legal outcome was comprehensive, sparing no one who had helped, incited, or attempted to hide the beast that mauled the boy's neck. Everyone realized that justice in Ashland is indivisible, and that the child's blood weighed heavier than all attempts to tamper with the evidence.
On a physical level, the result was a medical miracle mixed with permanent sorrow. The boy survived death by a hair's breadth, but doctors found that the nerve damage left a permanent mark. His smile would never be the same. The attack affected the nerves controlling his facial expressions, making every attempted joy look like a painful reminder of the assault. As for the dog, Mason, his result was a classification as a dangerous animal, destined to spend the rest of his life behind iron bars, much like the owners who had turned him into a monster. The most significant result in this tragedy was not just the prison sentences, but the liberation. The boy and his sister were freed from that domestic dungeon by judicial order and placed in the care of a legal guardian to live in an environment that knows no handcuffs. The walls of silence fell, the secrets were unveiled, and the world realized that behind closed curtains, demons wearing human skin may hide. The final result was the victory of the silent boy's voice over the noise of adult lies, closing a chapter of horror and beginning a chapter of recovery, even if it comes with a broken smile. When the prison doors slammed shut behind Angelina, Taylor, and Robert, other doors began to open in the lives of the little boy and his sister. The change in the story was not merely a change of address or a shift in legal status. It was a profound reconstruction of a soul shattered by chains. The transformation began the moment the boy felt for the first time that his hands could move freely without striking the chill of metal, that his room was no longer a cell, but a sanctuary. The siblings moved into the care of a new legal guardian, an environment filled with a warmth they have never known, where hands are used for gentle strokes, not for tying knots. However, the change carried a bitter undertone at first. The boy who survived Mason's fangs did not emerge entirely unscathed. The neurological damage to his face became a permanent signature of that tragedy. The physical change was tangible. When the boy tries to smile, a part of his face refuses to respond, resulting in a broken smile that tells the story of a struggle that hasn't fully ended. But within that broken smile, a new kind of strength was born. He began to learn how to process his trauma, realizing that the outside world is not entirely made of monsters and handcuffs. He became a symbol of resilience in Ashland County, a child who defeated betrayal with his small, fragile body.
At the community level, the case brought about a radical change in how cases of children with special needs are handled. No longer do the cries of children behind walls go unquestioned. Neighbors became more vigilant, and authorities grew firmer in monitoring temporary custody situations. The price was exorbitant, the blood of a 6-year-old. But the result was a new shield protecting other children from a similar fate. The House of Horrors transformed from a mere crime scene into a harsh lesson in social responsibility, reminding everyone that silence in the face of abuse is a crime in its own right. As for Angelina, the change was her transformation from a jailer to a prisoner. In her cell, she now has all the time to contemplate the tranquility she once chased with handcuffs. She realized, perhaps too late, that control built on fear always ends in collapse. The change in her life was being stripped of the highest title she could have held, mother. She became just a number in prison records, while her child began writing a new chapter of his life, far from her dark shadow. The most beautiful transformation was in the relationship between the boy and his sister. Both emerged from the tunnel of horror together, and they are now repairing their memories as one. The sister, who was once tied with ropes to witness her brother's torture, is now the one holding his hand, teaching him how to run freely in the park. Fear has been replaced by trust, and restraint by liberation. Although the scars on the boy's neck will always remind him of what happened, the true change occurred in the depths of his heart, where the memories of fangs were replaced by memories of safety. In the end, the story of the Ashland boy is a tale of light prevailing over darkness. The change did not erase the past, but it made the future possible. This little boy proved that the human spirit, even when bound by shackles, retains the power to fly the moment the lock is picked. The chains are gone, and the boy remains, with his imperfect smile and his perfect heart, to teach the world that freedom is not just the absence of restraints, but the presence of love and mercy.